Hi, everyone, and welcome to this STL Partners webinar focused on telecom APIs, telecom network APIs, and really trying to double click on what developers really want from these APIs. So the premise, I suppose, for this webinar is we feel there's a lot of industry momentum around network APIs. We as STL Partners, we're quite committed to this as an area of opportunity for the telcos and have been doing a lot of research on this as a space. But without understanding the end user, the end customer, and the developer, we're not going to be able to scale this as an opportunity for the industry. And we and other analyst firms can put out our market sizing forecasts showing billions of dollars of opportunity. But if we can't drive adoption within the developer community and understand the demand side, we won't be able to really capture any of those billions. So we feel we want to bring some of the demand side perspective to the supply side, and that's why we've done this developer survey, and again, that's the premise of the webinar today, running you through some of the results from this survey of developers across the US and Europe. So before I really get into the weeds of the content, a little intro and a bit of housekeeping. So those who haven't joined an STL webinar before, or a reminder for those who have, you're in listen-only mode on the GoToWebinar platform. You should have a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can communicate with us if you require, because we can't hear you if you're speaking. Hopefully you can hear me, but if you do have an audio issue, raise it in the chat and one of our team will get to it. Or of course, if throughout the presentation that we'll go through you have any questions, do put those in the question field, because either I can answer them as we go, if it's relevant to what I'm talking about, or I can answer them during the Q&A session at the end. So do please use that chat function and get in touch if you've got any questions. If you need to drop off, or if you've got colleagues that weren't able to join, we will be recording the session and we'll be sharing that recording after the webinar is concluded, along with the slides as well. So you'll get access to everything that we've shared today. And as a quick introduction to myself, if you haven't seen me on any webinars or panels or events before, I'm Darius. I'm one of the consulting directors at STL Partners, and I lead our work in the enterprise space. Really what I'm focused on within the enterprise space is the shift towards the platform business model for telcos. So I look a lot at the shift towards B2B2X, marketplace monetization, the shift towards as a service, NaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, and then data monetization, and of course APIs being a wrapper almost across those three pillars as an enabler, really, to help telcos shift towards that platform model. So I own the API topic within STL, and we'll be sharing some of our recent findings with you today. And we as STL have been looking at APIs for long before I joined STL Partners around 7 years ago. Almost 17 years now, we've been looking at the API opportunity for operators and building up our bank of consulting and research knowledge and insights in the space. For those who've been following STL for a long time, we used to be under the Telco 2.0 brand, looking at the two-sided business model for telecoms and the shift towards the platform business model. And looking at APIs again when it was ParlayX and GSM one API program rather than Open Gateway. And so we've got a good history or pedigree in this notion of API monetization. It was a little early 17 years ago, and we found some old blog posts talking about very similar trends and trajectories to what we talk about now. But there are more tailwinds, I think, recently. There's the strength of the hyperscale cloud providers. There's more industry collaboration and momentum. There's more commitment from the operators in that regard. So both on the technical and the commercial side, the JV from Aduna and the leading telco partners from players like Nokia and Network as Code driving aggregation, we feel like there's more industry momentum than there was, and togetherness, let's say, in collaboration than there was when this was tried 16 years ago. But all this to say, we've been working in this space for a long time. We've been doing a lot of consulting and strategy work over the past 4 or 5 years across the value chain with the operators directly, as well as with the aggregators, with the exposure platform players, et cetera, and that has led to a lot of the bank of insights that we've got available through our research, the market sizing forecast that I mentioned before that we've got, but also the developer survey that I'll be running through with you today. So if you do have any questions on where our research has come from or our knowledge and expertise in the API space, do let me know. Do either ask a question in the chat or reach out to me post the webinar. I'm very happy to run you through where this has come from. And this is a bit of a summary of what I said in the intro, but some of you may have missed that as you were just joining. But we, along with many analyst firms, see a growing trend towards network APIs, and we do feel like there is a forecast opportunity. It ranges. We've said 34 billion here by 2030. It ranges from kind of the 10 to the 300 billion, depending on which forecast or which analyst you're speaking to. But in general, we all agree that there is growth and there is an opportunity here for the telcos. And that's mirrored by, if we look at the open gateway signatories, that's grown from kind of the starting handful of leading operators to now just shy of 80. Now, that doesn't mean that all of those operators have a commercial launch or a technical launch of APIs, but they're committing to this as an area to try and invest in and build. And certainly over the past year and a half, we've seen the conversation with some of those kind of more hesitant operators, let's say, shift from, is this something that we should care about, to, okay, we feel like there is an opportunity that we should commit to. How do we really go about committing? So it's very much changed from a what discussion, I suppose, to a how. And I think, again, that shows that there's an industry buzz and an industry momentum behind this as a topic area. But it's all well and good having the total addressable market and having the supply side collaborating, but without understanding that demand side and the developer and the target customers that you're going to work with, you're not going to be able to capture any of that 34 billion, or if you look at the other forecasts, 100 billion, whatever number you want to put on it, you're not going to be able to capture any of that money and any of that opportunity if we don't understand and engage the developer community correctly. So that's really what the premise of this discussion in this webinar is it's giving a bit of an overview of our engagement with the developers, and then specifically from a survey that we ran in January and published in January around what the developers really want from telcos. So a reminder again, if you do have any questions as I go through, do put them in the chat or ask them as a question, and I'll try and get to them as we go. So what I wanted to do up front was give a bit of an overview of, when we say developers, who are we really talking about? Who did we survey, and who do we profile as part of these results? So the first split that I wanted to give was based on size of developer that we surveyed, because there is a bit of debate, I think, in the industry among analysts and among the telcos, of where will demand from the developer side really come from? Is it from the major enterprises that have development arms for internal development, or is it from kind of smaller startups and scale-ups where a lot of innovation happens and where maybe they get acquired by the bigger players and build in those capabilities into their own solutions? We wanted to get a bit of a mix, so a bit of a spread. We haven't focused too heavily on the very small. There were a few that were less than 10 that came through the funnel, but primarily looking at kind of mid to larger enterprises and developers from a employee size, but also from a revenue size. So we're not totally looking at startups and the scale-ups, but actually those that are slightly bigger as well. So this was looking at it by size. Another split that we wanted to show was based on region. So again, reminder, we started, and we're very happy and very willing to extend this survey, and especially if there is anyone that wants to get access to these survey results in their own countries, do let us know, because it may be that we can roll that out next in those specific areas. But we started in collecting results from the US and from the UK, and that meant that there were businesses that were headquartered across North America and across Europe primarily. So that's where this survey is focused. And I think the interesting follow-up question that we asked around which region do you really operate within was, where are your applications typically used? And the reason that we wanted to ask this was because of the implications on aggregation strategy. So I mentioned at the beginning, like players like Aduna, or players like Nokia Network as Code that are playing in this aggregation role at the moment. And I think that works as they're global aggregators, and they're looking to work with global partners like the hyperscalers and like the Infobits of the world to bring these APIs into these new regions at an aggregated level. So you don't have to work with one single operator and one single market. And that works for a country, for example, like the UK, or for a country like Spain or Italy, where the market in and of itself is probably too small for a single developer to want to serve on its own. Especially when you then segment that down by the operators within that region. Do I have to work with a BT and a Vodafone and a VMO2? Do I have to work with a TIM and a Vodafone Italy, et cetera, et cetera? So you can see in this pie chart on the bottom right that only a small proportion, only just less than a quarter of application developers that we surveyed within Europe, where their application works within only their local country. the majority, the overwhelming majority, either working in a few countries around Europe or actually global in nature. So here you can see having global availability and regional availability is quite important for developers in that market. There's no point in them serving only the UK. Whereas when we look at a country like the US, which is almost 5 times the size in terms of population of the UK, there is a much higher proportion, almost 50%, that operate within only that local country. That doesn't mean it won't have value in global aggregation or in working with players like Aduna and Nokia, etc. But it means that there's maybe more scope for local aggregation or regional aggregation. So if we applied this, for example, to Brazil, another big market by population, or China, or Indonesia, it may be that these markets are ripe for aggregation players that actually work only with those operators and can build very specific distribution ecosystems that target those very specific developers. So where Aduna and Nokia will focus on big global players and they have a strength to negotiate with those big global players, it may be that in Indonesia, international operators like Telin that already aggregate across those local operators for international connectivity actually have a strong role to play as a local aggregator, and they can then build up the distribution and the customer ecosystem themselves much faster and more effectively than global players can. And then you could look again at players like the Bridge Alliance Exchange that play more regionally in Asia Pacific. Do they have a different strength to target more regional developers or local developers as well? So we think this is an interesting finding early in the profiling of the survey respondents to say, well, sure, global availability is important, but we shouldn't forget that some markets will have their own local ecosystems where a local aggregation play may work very well. And I think China is probably another good example of that, where the US aggregators and US-based players will have no role in aggregating the Chinese operators. So yeah, I think this was an early interesting finding from the regional splits of these developers and where they operate. The next split in terms of the profile of the developers that we looked at was which are the target end customer segments that they're working towards. So are they enterprise focused? And here 343 of the 415 developers that we surveyed were building applications that could work with an enterprise endpoint. Just over 300 were working in apps, developing apps that could work with a consumer-focused endpoint, and then a smaller proportion working for other vendors or solution providers, or working on internal-facing apps within the organization. We did want to note that if we had developers that only built internal-facing apps, so didn't build any external-facing apps, we screened them out of the survey. So they had to be building some form of external capability as well, but they may be using internal APIs too. And the other kind of note is that the majority of developers that we surveyed were building kind of ready-made, off-the-shelf SaaS applications. Only 15% were also building kind of on a bespoke level. And I think, again, that's important to think about in terms of the applications that they're building. But maybe what's more interesting than this is the double click that says, okay, well, if they're building enterprise or consumer apps, what are the specific use cases that those developers are surveying? And we broke this down into 10 use case families. The majority of developers that we surveyed were building applications that could be clustered into enterprise productivity and IT, so collaboration and content tools, HR tools, that kind of stuff. But then, a not insignificant proportion also looking at IoT and device management use cases, or finance and payments, for example. So those together account for the biggest clusters of categories. But we also had a longer tail looking at things like anti-fraud and video analytics and advertising and marketing, or AR/VR type use cases as well. So we weren't prescriptive about which use cases they were building for. We wanted to get a sense of developers as a whole. And yeah, this was the long tail of applications here. So very few focused on kind of the AGVs and autonomous vehicles or autonomous drone side, more towards the left-hand side of this diagram. So that's the kind of profiles of the developers that we were talking to, because again, we're probably at risk in the industry of saying developers as a homogenous group, but actually they're quite heterogeneous in terms of who they're serving, the size of the enterprise, where they're focused, etc. They vertically or use case specific. So all of that is within the survey data, but wanted to give an overview of when we say developer now throughout the rest, who are we really talking about? What kind of applications are they building? And so that was a long list, about 10 questions that we asked within the survey to help profile the organization. We also then asked around questions around assessing those developers' usage of APIs. And this is an important point because the whole hypothesis around this survey was that developers will access network APIs and telco APIs through the existing channels, models, and experiences that they get through their existing channels. So where they access APIs and third-party APIs to date is likely where they'll want to access those third-party APIs and those network APIs as well. They won't want to change their behavior effectively to access these new capabilities. So we wanted to ask and assess how are they currently using APIs and what can we learn from that. We then asked them at the end of the survey a set of questions on their familiarity with telecom and network APIs. So first, we wanted to understand their usage of APIs to date, to then show the gap or the connection between their understanding and the definitions of network APIs, what it means to them, their preferred channels for network APIs, the attractiveness of those kinds of capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the overview of the survey. In the next section, as we go through the analysis, we won't go through all of these questions. I've taken kind of an extract of the ones that I thought were kind of compelling and interesting. But if you are interested in accessing the full results, again, do get in touch with me and let me know, and we can try and set up a call to run you through the deep dive, I suppose, or the double click on these further results and some of the other cuts and splits that we have within the webinar. So we did get a question here, which I might pause to take at the from Andres, which was, do you see the Aduna initiative complementing the Network as Code initiative, and what are the differences that you see? I think it's a really good question, and we'll talk a little bit about channel in a moment. When you ask these two companies, are they working together at the moment? They're not currently working together. Operators working with Aduna does not preclude operators working with Network as Code. It may be that the Network as Code is part of the exposure platform that they use and Aduna sits as a layer on top, but there isn't necessarily clarity at the moment from our perspective on how those two initiatives will really combine. I would guess and I would postulate that the operators that are part of Aduna don't see this as an Ericsson house, and they're not wanting to be exclusive to Ericsson in terms of their capabilities or in terms of Vonage for their distribution capabilities. So it won't preclude Nokia playing a key role here. It won't preclude other distributors playing a key role here. I think they won't necessarily be partnering together right now. I think Nokia and Ericsson will keep this relatively separate, at least in the short term. But I don't think working with one precludes you from working with the other. So you may see some operators having aggregation strategies through both Network as Code and Aduna. And I think they may have different strengths to target different distribution ecosystems. So Aduna targeting at the moment and strong with the hyperscalers and with more of the CPaaS side, I would say. Network as Code, especially with Nokia's strength in private networks, has a different distribution ecosystem that's maybe more enterprise and mission critical and industry focused. They've also been very targeted at the kind of 5G advanced capabilities. So the demo that they showed at MWC with Elmo cars was about quality on demand and automated driver assistance, whereas Aduna has focused a bit on the earlier opportunity and identity and anti-fraud. So they are complementing each other in that regard, I suppose, one targeting more mission critical enterprise and next gen capabilities, the other targeting some of the identity and anti-fraud. Okay, so moving on and getting into the kind of meat of the actual survey results and an extract of the analysis, there are three kind of major areas or content areas that I wanted to go through. The first was implications on channel strategy, and some of which I just mentioned to just then in the answer to the question to Andres. The second being on the capabilities that developers really care about or want from telco APIs, and the third being around commercials and commercial model. So if we start with channel, again, hypothesis for the survey was understand first how do they access APIs to date. Second was to follow up with specifically their understanding of network APIs. So we asked this question that said, what are your current channels through which you access third-party or external APIs? And we gave a whole host of different options for where we felt from our interviews with developers, they often access these APIs. And what you can see is that 356 out of the 415 developers that we surveyed access APIs through one or more of the cloud provider channels. That's 70% more than the second chosen option, which was the SIs, which just over half of developers said they would access APIs through one of their systems integrator partners. So I think this shows that the cloud provider partners are pretty critical in the space. They're not ones to be overlooked, and it makes sense as to why the aggregators, as well as the telcos directly, have been trying to forge those relationships with the hyperscalers. And we'll come on to more of that in a moment. But what we also wanted to ask in a follow-up question was which providers or organizations, and this was an open text answer that we allowed the developers to respond to, which organizations provide the best experience for API usage in terms of their platform design, the look and feel, the documentation, etc. And the hyperscalers were the top three mentioned organizations, or the North American hyperscalers, which again makes sense because we were skewed to Europe and North America for this survey. So Azure was the top with 25%, then AWS with 21%, and Google with 15% of developers, naming them specifically as having the best experience. So it's clear the hyperscalers are both best practice in terms of thinking about API usage and getting things utilized by the developers, but also in terms of just pure reach and access into the developer community. The third point that I kind of wanted to make on here, though, the first being hyperscalers are important, the second being systems integrators are still key here, and they'll have a slightly different ecosystem of developers, again, that they can target versus the cloud providers. The third point here is that if we look at the API aggregator hubs, which we'd class as kind of the CPaaS style players like Twilio or Vonage or Cinch or Infobip, and then we also look at the telco, there's kind of parity here. 133 to 124 isn't a significant difference. So developers, when we think about API monetization, and again, this isn't network APIs, this is just APIs in general, they have been looking to the telecoms operator as a channel to potentially access those APIs. And this speaks to the fact that APIs aren't new, and API monetization isn't new. Many operators have been successfully monetizing APIs through SMS and A2P, etc., for a long time, and they're now looking to convert those businesses into the network API standards. And while that's a positive that says, look, this is a model that you understand, this is something that you've been doing before, it also actually has a negative where you start to get into a discussion around cannibalization. So is the shift towards the network API standard cannibalizing telco SMS revenues or the existing CPaaS standards that some telcos monetize? And does that create a hesitancy in the industry or a slowness to move towards more compelling commercial models or some of the new standards around network APIs? So I think that's another dynamic that's quite interesting, not specific to the developers, but more on the supply side. And then we followed that question up. So that was usage of APIs in general. We followed that question up with specifically what might be your most preferred channel for telecom network APIs. And this was a ranking question. And what we're showing on the chart here is the percentage of developers that chose that segment as their top most choice. So 43%, again, still chose the cloud provider as the primary channel. But what you can see is when you look at the ranking, telecom operators for telco APIs bumps up above the SI, and the CPaaS players are then coming in fourth. Why I think this is important to understand is that, yes, the hyperscalers are the most crucial partners here. Again, clear, demonstrated, they have a strong reach into the developer community. But telcos not only need to think about the SIs that have a different developer reach to the hyperscalers, and think about the CPaaS players that, again, have that different reach into the developer community, more around identity and anti-fraud and communications and contact centers, etc. But they also need to think about their own direct routes to market and their own direct channels, because they do have a role to play here. And when we move away from some of the more wholesale-driven APIs like identity and anti-fraud and SIM swap and number verify, and we move towards some of the more differentiated propositions that are more NAS driven, like quality on demand, some of the edge workload mobility or edge node discovery APIs, etc., there is more of a role for operators to play direct and to build a stronger relationship and brand with their developer or enterprise customers directly. So basically, operators don't just think about the wholesale model when you're targeting developers, but also think about your own direct strategy. The other point that I wanted to make on this, which leads into the next slide, is that while hyperscalers are, a pivotal and crucial partner in this economy, the relationships that operators and aggregators have with the hyperscalers to date has focused primarily on what we'd call passive marketplaces. So you get that API on that hyperscaler marketplace. Any developers using that marketplace can find those APIs. That works when it's a very mature market, or there's a lot of existing awareness in the space around how to use those APIs and what they're for and the business drivers. But the API opportunity for telcos this time around is quite new. even though APIs have been on the CPaaS side being monetized for a long time, some of these telco and network APIs are new. And so there's a need to drive a bit of education on the developer side. And hyperscaler passive marketplaces aren't necessarily going to drive that active adoption. So yes, it's available for lots of developers to access, but they don't know necessarily what they're accessing or why they should access it. And hyperscalers haven't yet built APIs as kind of native into their own solutions and capabilities. There was the announcement of Google Firebase, which is exciting, and it would be interesting to see how that develops, because that could drive a lot of usage around some of the SIM swap and verification APIs. But generally, when we talk API monetization through hyperscalers, it's passive marketplaces. So it does beg the question, who's going to do that education? If it's going to sit on a hyperscaler marketplace, how are you going to do the legwork to make sure that developers that see that on the marketplace know what they're using and how to use it and can self-serve effectively to use those APIs? And I think this next slide summarizes why that's so pivotal and so important, because we asked the question, what do you understand by the term network APIs? And again, this was a free text answer that we've analyzed and tried to categorize. So we've got pretty cautious and strict, let's say, about how we categorize. So 35% were kind of random definitions, or they didn't know, or they were unclear definitions of network APIs. And then in the yellow, so that 10% in the yellow, the dark yellow and the lighter yellow, these were definitions that we felt married well to open gateway style or Camara style definitions of network APIs. So either for accessing and managing telecoms network information and capabilities, for example, 4G and 5G, or those related more to accessing information specifically related to telecoms networks, so through SMS or voice, etc. So we feel like those definitions align at least somewhat closely to the Camara and Open Gateway idea of network APIs. But then almost 2/3 in the dark blue showing these different definitions of what network APIs could mean to the developer, more focused on the management of data exchange between different applications over many networks, or the management of IT networks as a whole across cloud, not necessarily specific to telco, but across their IT management. So we felt those definitions weren't really relevant to when operators now in Open Gateway talk about network APIs. So only 10% of the developers we surveyed had a real understanding of network APIs. And I think this shows that, again, education is pivotal. And so you can put an API on a developer marketplace for the hyperscalers and access 80% of those developers, but only 10% of them actually know what that API is or what it could do and why they might use it. So they'll never look for it. So again, I think this emphasizes it's great to have the hyperscaler relationship. You absolutely have to build it, but you've got to do the education as well. And that should sit with the telco to build those SDKs and the documentation and the how-to videos and the references and the user stories, for example, as well as with the hyperscalers and with the Adunas and the Nokias of the world, etc. Now, I mentioned at the start that those global aggregators had a strength to partner and negotiate with some of those global hyperscalers or those global distributors. So it could be a role for those players to drive and negotiate on that education and trying to push the hyperscalers to be more active and to build more of this into their solutions and to do more of the hackathons and to be more present in that, to get that developer adoption really driving and the flywheels turning. But again, haven't seen as much of that to date. It's been primarily on the passive marketplaces. So really critical is driving this education and doing that through more active channels as well as the passive marketplace channels. So with that, I wanted to move away from channel and to talk a little bit about capabilities for developers. And I think this chart goes neatly with the previous chart, because it shows more about demand and marrying that lack of education, let's say, with what we think is a high demand for some of these network API-driven capabilities. So we asked the question to developers, how important is connectivity for the applications that you actually develop? And we had 4 options, as well as an ignore or another and don't know. The top option being that they develop applications that require a high performance level of connectivity. The second being they develop applications that would run much better with high performance connectivity, but could function on best efforts. The third being we only need a basic best efforts connectivity and can work in an interrupted or slow environment. And then the fourth being we develop apps that could work offline or don't require connectivity at all. And nearly 2/3 fit within that blue category of either requiring or functioning much better with a high performance level of connectivity. And what we think is that that is a clear addressable market for the need for differentiated connectivity solutions and the shift towards more NAS-driven propositions. So while only 10% of developers understand the dynamic capabilities of the network and this new movement towards orchestrating capabilities around APIs, there are 2/3 that actually say, well, being able to leverage those capabilities more readily would be very useful for me and for my applications. So, while yes, doom and gloom, only 10% know now what those capabilities are, there is a large addressable market for developers that would want to access those sorts of capabilities. And a kind of follow-up point, I suppose, that we want to make around that is here we're talking about the shift towards non-best efforts capabilities. That doesn't necessarily chime with anti-fraud and identity and SIM swap and number verify. Those are more providing information from the network or information that the network holds or the telecom operator holds to developers in a new and a more agile format rather than big unwieldy Excel databases. This is talking about the shift towards differentiated connectivity and more kind of the quality on demand, the slice configuration, some of the edge APIs as well. So we think again, this is showing that there is also an addressable market, not just in the earlier years for the identity and anti-fraud, but actually in the future and the mid and long term around these differentiated connectivity propositions. So don't have just an eye on the identity and the short-term opportunity, but you should be thinking about the future opportunity and APIs that help drive towards the more NAS view of the world, or APIs that are more on the orchestration of the network side, not just providing some information that the network holds. So again, we think this is an interesting chart showing that difference between education and where we are now to the addressable market, but also showing that there is a desire for use cases and APIs that move beyond just identity and into the kind of the NAS world or the network orchestration world. And we followed that up with a question that asked developers on the top three most attractive network capabilities, telecom network capabilities for them. And we gave a very long list of different capabilities. We didn't ask them, and need to stress, we didn't ask them for specific APIs. We didn't say, are you going to use a quality on demand API? Will you use a slice configuration API? Will you use a SIM swap API? But instead, from the interviews that we do with developers, we built up a portfolio of kind of capabilities that they'd raised. And then we surveyed back to the developers on those capabilities. So what we're showing here are the top three selected capabilities. The top one being 54% saying they'd like a capability to access better and more accurate information on how the network is currently performing. So things around latency and jitter. The second most chosen option was understanding the status of devices connected to the network, so more of an IoT-based use case. And then the third was specifying and guaranteeing the performance level of the network for a period of time. So the first point that I wanted to make here is we surveyed based on capabilities, not on APIs. What you can clearly see is the red one here specifying the performance level of the network. That does back engineer towards a quality on demand or a slice-esque capability. Understanding the status of the device, that might back engineer to more of the device management API capability. But this one on the left, the accessing information on how the network is currently performing, there is no current standard or discussion around this as an API. But time and time again, when we run these surveys and when we interview developers directly, this comes up as the number one capability that developers want in this shift towards non-best efforts networking. And again, from this survey where we asked about a whole host of different capabilities, including verifying a user and including accessing location data, this capability comes out as the top, and there isn't yet a standard around how an API could provide that information. So we feel like this is a really clear signal to the industry and to the standards bodies to look at how APIs could provide some of this information. And we feel like because it is an information API rather than orchestration API, it may be more simple to provide than quality on demand and actually capture an earlier market than being able to monetize, I guess, and guarantee a specific level of performance and look at the use cases that will try and enable. I think there's a broader portfolio of developers and use cases that would work with this network performance information API. Now, we do get a bit of pushback sometimes from the operators that say, well, can't developers already get some of this information from the network? And it's true, they can get that information, but the interviews that we have, the developers suggest that it's quite still difficult and time consuming and costly to get that information, or it's not as real time as they'd want. And sometimes we get the feedback that also, as well as how the network is currently performing, they'd like an indication of the future performance of the network, so a bit more predictive. And I think that's very interesting when we start to think about some of the AI and the agentic capabilities coming through on the network autonomy side. If you could get more predictive about the network, that's another package of data that you could expose from the network that would have a huge amount of value to developers building more network embedded services. So not giving them access to the network to orchestrate their own capabilities or for devices to make decisions on how the network is performing, that's still quite futuristic. But just being able to predict at this time, in this location, this is the likely performance of that network in terms of latency and jitter, and being able to provide that as a very accurate packet of information so that broadcasters, for example, could know what their resource would be for live video broadcasting, or anyone doing a kind of a drone flight may know that, okay, well, at this time in that location, I'll have the right performance that I require. So I think that's an interesting finding from the survey and from the interviews, this capability that isn't yet an API-driven capability, but would lend itself very well to being API-ified. So yeah, we think that's an interesting capability. And the other point that I kind of touched on earlier, just to summarize, is the interest in verification and user authentication was quite low from the developers that we surveyed. Again, we haven't focused on only big banking customers, and that's not to say that there isn't a lot of spend on that as an industry, but it wasn't the top chosen choice. So again, keep an eye if you're an operator or an aggregator looking at monetizing APIs on the mid and longer term opportunities beyond anti-fraud and identity and in some of these other areas. And the other one was, we speak a lot to operators that are interested in monetizing the location data. And we've had quite a few inbound requests looking at location data monetization. We felt and we thought that would be a higher up choice from developers. We feel like that is an interesting capability for them. But again, we were surprised that was relatively mid-table in the longer list of capabilities, that we asked about. Much more focus on a said network performance information and those capabilities rather than specifically accessing location. And I think a part of the rationale for that is that they can already access some of those location capabilities to date through satellite data and other means. So the understanding that it may be more granular, it may be more reliable and accurate through precise location from the network, that hasn't yet translated into an understanding on the developer side for why I would need that capability. So it's not as new, whereas some of these capabilities are newer to the developer. And I think that's interesting because it has implications on whether it's an existing market or not. Can I target and access that market today, or is there a lot of education required? But it also has a big impact on the commercial model, because existing capabilities, you're more likely to be competing with another standard. So SIM swap number verify, you're competing directly with the CPaaS authentication standards. So you'll compete more directly on price. Whereas some of these newer capabilities, while there's more education required and more development required, they were also previously black boxed. So there's a bit more art of the possible and a bit more premium potentially associated with them. So yeah, it has an impact directly on the commercial model as well. And that kind of leads me on to the last section of the presentation, looking at the commercials that came out of the developer survey. And we asked the question, what model describes the typical payment structure for your external APIs? Is it totally free? And luckily, only 6% said that APIs would be free in all cases. So there's a big addressable market, again, a willingness and understanding that they'll have to pay for these capabilities. 42% did say, look, the APIs that we use is too varied. We can't say it's one model or another, but in general, we have to pay. And then the rest saying, look, 14% saying basically it's free up to a certain threshold, and then we have to pay. And then the rest saying, look, it's a paid service. We then double clicked and said, well, what's the actual model for how you pay? 46%, the top choice, saying that they pay through some subscription. So it's an all-you-can-eat model around the usage of those APIs. 34% saying the API usage is bundled as part of another platform that they access. So those two go quite hand in hand, a subscription and a bundle offering. So it might be bundled into a solution that they access or as part of a cloud platform. And only 13% said that the typical model would be a totally per transaction, pay per API call. Now, I think this is interesting because early operator models have focused very heavily on the per transaction, following quite closely to what we've seen in the CPaaS world. So the example in CPaaS is you pay about 10 cents per call, and that's the base case for API call, and it's a volume game. And that's the model that we've seen the early operators take around identity and anti-fraud is looking more at a pay per use. Now, it might not be literally per call, it might be in a tiered bucket. So for 500,000 to 1 million calls, it's this price. For 1 million to 2 million calls, it's this price per call. But effectively, you're still monitoring a volume of calls that go through that platform. Now, I mentioned the capabilities, whether it's existing or new, has an impact on the commercial model. And I think that raises the question as the third bullet point here. Can operators justify a premium on top of that kind of base case of around 10 cents per call? We saw in the early launches operators trying to justify quite a heavy premium. We think not all operators, but many operators trying to justify a heavy premium for this being a more robust API experience, being a better, more seamless experience for the end user, and saying, well, look, we can justify charging slightly more. Our perspective is that maybe that'll work in the early days, but this will become a commodity game very quickly because you are targeting an existing market, and it will come down most closely to price. Why would I increase my cost as a developer when I could get this similar information, even if it's slightly more cumbersome for a cheaper elsewhere? Whereas some of those new capabilities are said it's black box, there isn't an existing standard. So that might justify more of a premium against this kind of 10 cents per call idea and getting upwards closer towards $1 and beyond. We did ask that question specifically around pricing in the survey in the full set of the results. So can operators justify a premium? We think yes, in some cases, for some of those previously black box capabilities, but for some of the APIs where you're competing more directly with an existing standard, whether that's kind of location verification or some of the anti-fraud ones, we think no, it's less easy for operators to do that. We did ask the question, and this is the fourth bullet, which is a bit obscure just based on the bullet point text itself, but I'll explain a bit more. We did ask the question, what would justify a premium around some of those APIs? Would it be, a reduced code burden? Is it time to market? Is it the security in this case of the API, or is it the reliability and accuracy of the API? And security and accuracy were the top two chosen choices. Again, in the full set of the survey results, you can see all of you can see all of the results across those different components. But here we've pulled out the top two. So 70% of developers said that if it had a demonstrable improvement to the cybersecurity of that API call, they might, that might justify a premium. And 63% saying if they could really demonstrate the improved accuracy of that API call, then that might justify a premium as well. So I mentioned, location wasn't that top of a chosen choice in terms of the capability from the network that developers wanted to access, because maybe they're already accessing similar capabilities to date, and that leads to more of a commodity game. If operators and their partners could demonstrate that by using the telco API standard, there was a demonstrable and a significant improvement in the accuracy of that location data, that might justify a premium versus the existing standard. So I think that's really what we mean here when we're talking about kind of improvement in accuracy and where you can justify a premium. So moving on, one of the complexities that we wanted to paint, and we'll actually be double clicking on this in a future webinar that's at the end of May. So do look out for that. So we'll be looking at this from the success factors for APIs for telcos monetizing APIs and NAS. But we wanted to paint this kind of landscape where API monetization and commercial models and pricing models might vary by customer segment. They might vary by the use case and the value of each of the use cases that you're delivering. They differ by specific API, and they might therefore all have different commercial models or blends of commercial models across these portfolios. So let me kind of walk you through step by step what I mean by this. If we had a customer within the emergency services segment that was using a kind of drone, emergency response drone use case, that might use connectivity status or a network performance information API, as we've explained earlier in this session. It might use a quality on demand API, and it might use a location retrieval API. And that connectivity status API might be a per transaction volume model. That's how the product's been built. The quality on demand might be more time-based in terms of how long am I using that quality on demand slice. And location retrieval might be bundled into the part of the solution, so it's free. We're not going to charge you for it. We then might have a media and entertainment customer using temporary compute for events. So they've got a stadium venue that's got a big Beyonce concert. And so they need to spin up or use a stronger performance network, high performance network. So again, they might use quality on demand and the connectivity status APIs to manage that resource. But now the quality on demand might be more performance based. So depending on the tier of service that they're accessing or the consumer itself is accessing through the stadium, and maybe the status check is bundled as part of the solution because it's just proving to say, well, yes, the performance is degrading, switch on to the quality of demand use case. So it's bundled because you're effectively monetizing the QOD rather than this API. So slightly different model again. And then for manufacturing customer, using a surveillance video analytics solution might use all three of those APIs, again, with slightly different models where they're all tied together and packaged in a different way. So already just with three different use cases in three different customer segments, you've got quite a messy tapestry of potential commercial models that might work for those different customers. And I mentioned, the developer segment and the enterprise segment is not homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous. So within manufacturing, you might have different models that work for different customers. And within media and entertainment, different developers that want different use cases, different models that work for them. So if you're a very strong platform business, like the hyperscalers are, you'd have models that work for all of those different customer segments. But telcos aren't good at being platform businesses, and I would hypothesize that it would be difficult for operators, both on the people perspective, the product teams and the sales teams, as well as on the actual technical perspective, to manage all of these different models, because each of these lines and permutations likely has to be an individual product in the telco's catalog, and that becomes too unwieldy to manage. So how do operators really simplify this and get it down to the building blocks so that you could stitch together these different models, and a customer or even a partner that's reselling could stitch together these different models using APIs, using different commercials, and using different situational pricing to actually get to an outcome that works for them and doesn't leave value off the table, I suppose, for the telco, where you've underpriced, you've gone too wholesale, and you're leaving value for the OTT players to capture. So I wanted to paint this as a complexity, I suppose, in the commercial model. Yes, developers in general want to move towards subscription and all you can eat, and they don't want to be charged per transaction. But realistically, for each developer group and different use case and different API, you'll have a set of commercial models that you may want to enable. So this is a very futuristic vision, but one that, again, operators should have an eye on as they start to build and think through the platforms they can use to monetize network APIs and to really work for the developer. A good platform business, as I said, will be able to monetize through all of these different avenues through different B2B partners, moving to that B2B2X model and for different developers. So conscious of time and wanting to wrap up to leave 10 or so minutes, sorry, for kind of Q&A at the end. So if you do have a question, do please drop it in the chat. Before key takeaways from the webinar, first being kind of build targeted active channels to reach developers and to reach a diverse range of developers. So the SIs, the systems integrators, will have a different kind of strength in more vertically integrated, more industrial, more enterprise focused applications than perhaps the hyperscalers will, or perhaps the CPaaS providers will. So you need to build a targeted strategy to make sure you're reaching the most unique developers. But also you need that active channel so it doesn't sit on a passive marketplace where, sure, it could be accessed by lots of developers, but there's no awareness and there's no education so that they know what they're accessing to actually drive that adoption. That leads into the second takeaway, which is that telcos, I feel, must be accountable for education, even though many partners in the ecosystem will support and will be responsible for driving that education. And Nokia and Aduna should differentiate their offering by driving more of this education. It's the telcos that should be accountable. They shouldn't just sit back and expect their partners to do this. They should be building up the knowledge. They should be building up the documentation, the how-to videos. They should be building up the references and the success stories so that they can take this to different partners and say, hey, this is a key capability. You should be building this into your solutions to go to market and making yourself an invaluable partner to them. Don't just sit back and try and wholesale this with no accountability yourselves. Otherwise, I don't think this market will scale. And when we get onto the future more NAS and orchestration-driven APIs, you won't have the skill set or the knowledge or the capability to monetize it yourself, and you'll give too much value away to your wholesale partners. The third takeaway, I think, is that there's demand for NAS APIs or these orchestration APIs, which moves us beyond identity and anti-fraud. So again, have an eye on those mid to longer term use cases and think about how you build for those, not just focused on the big banking customers that are looking to push towards anti-fraud. And the fourth kind of key takeaway I think that you should have from this webinar is think about and it should say operators and their aggregator and distribution partners really, but they should build for more complex future commercial models as well as the models that they can monetize to date, which is a simple volume kind of times transaction. Your existing platforms and capabilities can manage that, but this is going to get more complex. There'll be more commercial models through more and more partners, and you need to have an eye on that so you don't build technical debt in your platform to date, and it makes it more difficult, I suppose, or expensive and costly to monetize those models in the future. So do have an eye on that as well. And with that, I wanted to move to Q&A. And so if you do have any questions, as said, please do drop them in the chat. So I'll try and manage these for the next 10 minutes or so. So another question from Andres: what do you see as the best success case study in the industry leveraging network APIs? There are few and far between case studies at the moment, because this is still quite an early opportunity in terms of the Kamara and the Open Gateway APIs. Many operators, Vodafone, Telstra, BT, Verizon, had been monetizing APIs in a more bespoke fashion with their enterprise customers beforehand, and they're now looking to migrate those to the Kamara and Open Gateway standard. So there have been success stories in the operator community, from a API perspective in general. From the Open Gateway and Kamara perspective specifically, that's the more new area, the more nascent market. The most prevailing case study, I suppose, that we have, which is kind of touted around the industry, is the Infobip case study in Brazil with Claro, Vivo, and TIM. So they're working with the three major operators in Brazil to run an anti-fraud solution. I haven't got up-to-date numbers since MWC, but I did ask Infobip in the run-up to MWC, and I think they were getting just over 500,000 API calls per day for that solution, having launched it halfway through last year, I think. So, still early days in terms of building up their customer base. I'm sure they have more than that now, so I should get some up-to-date numbers. But I think that's the kind of leading example of the monetization of Open Gateway APIs so far. There are other examples of launches in Asia. Telkomsel have their Telco Verify solution, which leverages SIM swap and number verify, I believe. Singtel have their Sing Verify solution as well. So there are some case studies of launches. In terms of specific numbers, don't have masses of data so far, but hopefully over the next few months or so post NWC, we'll start to see a few more operator launches and a few more numbers coming from the operator community, because again, the three major US operators, for example, are set to launch SIM swap and number verify and device location verification, which they hadn't launched yet. So once that launches, again, we'll start to see hopefully more success and actual revenues come from this. So a question here from Saud, I believe. So could you share if customers are willing to pay more for QoD compared to network performance, or if they value all APIs at 10 cents? So when we've spoken to enterprise developers and enterprise customers, and we've asked around these capabilities, we do find that there is a willingness to pay. There is a higher willingness to pay for the network orchestration capabilities than the kind of pure verification and CPaaS-driven APIs. And in our total addressable market sizing, we do give a higher value to QoD and to the network performance information API call than we do for the others. So yes, we do think it's more valuable. We think that's in part driven by the fact that operators should be going more direct with some of those capabilities. So it's less wholesale driven, and there's less competing standards. So there's more of a premium justified, we believe. So it will hold its value for longer as well, because it's less of a wholesale commodity game, and there's more differentiation possibly for the operator based on the level of QoD that they can provide. So yes, in short, we do think that there'll be a higher willingness to pay beyond 10 cents. The complexity will come in terms of the benchmark of QoD likely to be monetized more on a time-bound basis rather than per call. So yes, it's more valuable, but also the way that you would monetize it would be different. And fundamentally, there'll be much lower volume. So yes, identity is only 10 cents per call, but you're probably likely to have millions more calls per day for identity APIs globally than you would for a quality on demand API. So lower volume for QoD, but higher value, retain its value for longer, more of a direct play. The identity APIs, lower value, more commoditized, will reduce in value over time, but are much higher volume play. So a question here from Rohit. Are there categories within the wireline, so non-wireless network API space that's eliciting interest from telcos? I think that's a great question. And Open Gateway, naturally, because it's come from the GSMA, has been more mobile and wireless centric. But they did do a demo between Orange and Colt this year, which was about how you deliver NAS and quality on demand across a hybrid mobile and fixed network. And now they do have a category of network APIs within Open Gateway, which is dedicated to fixed networks. So we're starting to see that come in. And particularly when we talk about NAS and quality on demand, that's come from the fixed world, really. Mobile has been slow to adopt that standard and to think about that. The fixed operators like Colt, like Tata, like BT Business, they have been much faster to NAS, and they have a different view of what NAS is compared to mobile. So I think that those worlds are starting to converge and starting to blur, and some of the quality on demand stuff does blur those lines. For some of the other APIs, I think there's less relevance. And as said, Open Gateway has focused more on the wireless. But yeah, starting to see some interest on the wireline perspective in the hybrid model around quality on demand, and certainly trying to bring mobile and fixed onto a more converged platform there. So a question here from Alif, and apologies again if I'm not saying that correctly, but do you think network APIs are suited to be sold in marketplace platform? I think in short, yes. I think it does make sense eventually for network APIs to be on marketplaces. Hyperscaler marketplaces do have a big reach into the developer community, and the marketplace model works for APIs. That is how lots of developers do access APIs, whether it's hyperscale or even the Rapid API marketplace that Nokia acquired. So in short, yes. I think my point is more that passive marketplaces now, because we're at such an early stage of education and awareness, may not drive adoption even if they have availability. So you need to have, in combination with the passive marketplace, an active channel or an active education to make sure that when developers see that API on the marketplace, they know what it's for and they're interested in using it, etc., etc. We actually have a report that we publish which specifically calls out the role of marketplaces in the API economy. So do look for that on our website. So a question here from Basavaraj. So you'd like to know if there's a platform for developers to express their interest on API/use cases. I have to admit, not that I know of, so a kind of a forum, I guess, for them to kind of come and say, yes, this worked, this didn't. I think there's lots of disparate places that developers might do that. So Kamara, for example, it was set up to get that developer feedback. So it's not just operators, it's not just vendors. There are developers as part of the Kamara forum. So I think that is one place. Nokia, I know, have been doing a lot of API days and hackathons, which is another time point, let's say, for them to give feedback on their interest of APIs and the use cases. And some of the other platforms, the developer platforms like Infobip, they'll be getting feedback from their end customers. They can feed backwards as well. But I don't know if there's a big centralized forum necessarily that I'd say is leading in that space. And if you do have any questions on the survey insights that I've gone through today, do reach out directly. So Amy Cameron, who's the research director, authored part of that report. And of course, I'm Darius. I own the API topic within STL, so you can reach out to me directly as well. If you've got any further questions, if you want to see any of the details that we didn't go through, if you want to see the survey Excel in full, let us know and we'd happily set up a call. And with that, thanks everyone for your time and thanks for joining. And looking forward to speaking to you soon.